so short a time span and such personal contact in this case make it idle to talk of legend with regard to the information in this formula. Secondly, the burial story of Jesus is part of a very old source used by Mark in writing his gospel. When you read the Gospels, you find that they tend to consist of brief snapshots of Jesus' life and ministry, which are only loosely connected, rather like pearls on a string, and not always chronologically arranged. But when we come to the so-called Passion story, the story of the final week of Jesus' suffering and death, then we do have one smooth, continuously running narrative. This suggests that the Passion story was one of Mark's sources that he used in writing his gospel. Now, most scholars already think that Mark is the earliest of the four Gospels, and obviously his Passion source must then be even earlier still, some of the earliest material in the New Testament. Comparison of the narratives of the four Gospels with each other show that their accounts do not diverge from each other until after the burial story. They are in agreement right up through the burial account. This implies that the burial account is part of that pre-Markan Passion source that Mark used in writing his gospel. So we have here independent, early attestation of the fact of Jesus' burial in this pre-Markan Passion source, in addition to the early information that is mediated by Paul in his tradition handed on to the Corinthians. Number three, as a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court that condemned Jesus to death, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. There was a very strong resentment in the early Christian church toward the Jewish leadership responsible for the condemnation of Jesus. They had, in effect, engineered a judicial murder of Jesus of Nazareth. And therefore, it's highly improbable that Christians would invent a member of the very court that condemned Jesus to death who would give him a proper burial instead of allowing his body to be disposed like a common criminal. And therefore, most scholars think we actually know the identity of the person who buried Jesus of Nazareth, namely Joseph from Arimathea. Fourth, no competing burial story exists. If the burial story about Joseph were fictitious, then we would expect to find either some other historical trace of what actually happened to Jesus' corpse, or at least some competing legends of what happened. But all of our sources are unanimous in ascribing to Joseph the honorable interment of Jesus in the tomb. For these and several other reasons, the vast majority of New Testament scholars today concur that Jesus of Nazareth was in fact buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. According to the late John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. Fact number two, on the Sunday morning following his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Among the reasons that have led most scholars to this conclusion are the following 5 points. Number one, the empty tomb story is also part of the pre-Markan Passion source and therefore very early. The Passion source used by Mark did not end in defeat and death with the burial story. Rather, it ends with the empty tomb account, which is grammatically one piece with the burial narrative. Secondly, the old tradition cited by Paul in his first letter to the church in Corinth implies the fact of the empty tomb. For any first century Jew to say, as this formula did, that he was buried and that he was raised would imply that an empty grave was left behind. Moreover, the expression, he was raised on the third day, probably derives from the date of the women's visit to the empty tomb on the third day in Jewish reckoning after Jesus' crucifixion. The four-line tradition which Paul cites summarizes both the Passion narrative in the Gospels as well as the early apostolic preaching in the book of Acts. And significantly, what corresponds in each to the third line of the formula, and that he was risen, in both cases is the narrative and proclamation of the empty tomb. Thirdly, Mark's story of the empty tomb is simple and lacks signs of legendary embellishment. All one has to do to appreciate this point is to compare Mark's account to the accounts which are found in the later apocryphal Gospels. These are forgeries that arose during the centuries following the appearance of the New Testament. These do contain all sorts of wild, legendary accounts about the resurrection. For example, in the so-called Gospel of Peter, which is a forgery from the second half of the 2nd century after Christ, the tomb is surrounded not only by a Roman guard, but also by all of the chief priests and the Pharisees, as well as a huge crowd of people from the surrounding countryside who have come to watch the tomb. Suddenly, during the night, a voice rings out from heaven, and the stone over the door of the tomb rolls back by itself. Then 2 men are seen descending out of heaven and entering into the tomb. Then 3 men, gigantic figures, come out of the tomb. The heads of 2 of the men reach to the clouds. The head of the 3rd man overpasses the clouds. And then a cross comes out of the tomb, and a voice from heaven asks, "Hast thou preached to them that sleep?" And the cross answers, "Yea." Now, these are how real legends look. They are colored with all sorts of theological and apologetical motifs, motifs which are conspicuously lacking from the Markan account, which by comparison is stark in its simplicity. Number 4, the fact that women's testimony was less trustworthy than that of men in 1st century Palestine counts in favor of the women's role in the discovery of the empty tomb. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, illustrates the attitude toward the testimony of women in Jewish society when he says, due to the levity and the temerity of their sex, women should not be allowed to serve as legal witnesses in a court of law. The testimony of women was regarded as so untrustworthy that it wouldn't even be admitted into a Jewish court, according to Josephus. So any later legendary account of the discovery of the empty tomb would certainly have made male disciples, like Peter and John, discovered the empty tomb. The fact that it is women whose testimony was regarded as worthless, who are the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb, is best explained by the fact that they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the gospel writers faithfully record what for them was an awkward and embarrassing fact. Number 5, the earliest Jewish allegation that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body, which is found in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 15, shows that the body was in fact missing from the tomb. What was the earliest Jewish response to the disciples' proclamation, "He is risen from the dead"? That these men are full of new wine? That his corpse is still there in the tomb in the hillside? No, They responded, "The disciples came and stole away his body." Now think about that. The disciples came and stole away his body. The earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was itself a feeble attempt to try to explain away why the body was missing. And thus we have evidence for the empty tomb, which is absolutely top drawer, because it comes not from the Christians, but from the very opponents of the early Christian movement. Now I could go on, but I think that enough has been said to indicate why, in the words of Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist, and I quote, "By far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb." Fact number 3, on multiple occasions and under a variety of circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. This is a fact which is universally acknowledged today by New Testament scholars for at least the following 3 reasons. Number 1, the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances, which is quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, guarantees that such appearances occurred. These included appearances to Peter, or Cephas as his Aramaic name is given, the 12 disciples, the 500 brethren, and James, Jesus' own younger brother. Secondly, the appearance traditions in the Gospels provide multiple independent attestation of these appearances. This is one of the most important earmarks of historicity, multiple early independent attestation. For example, the appearance to Peter is independently attested by Luke and Paul. The appearance to the 12 is independently attested by Luke, John, and Paul. We also have independent witness to Galilean appearances in Mark, Matthew, and John, as well as independent traditions of appearances to the women in Matthew and John. Thirdly, certain appearances have earmarks of historicity. For example, we have very good evidence in the Gospels that neither James nor any of Jesus' younger brothers were believers in Jesus during his lifetime. There's no reason whatsoever that the early church would generate fictitious stories concerning the unbelief of Jesus' own family had they been faithful followers of Jesus all along. And so it's reasonably certain historically that neither James nor his other brothers were followers of Jesus during his lifetime. But it is equally indisputable that James and his brothers did become active Christian believers following Jesus' death. James was considered to be an apostle in the early church, and he eventually rose to the position of sole leadership of the Jerusalem church. In fact, according to the first century historian Josephus, whom I alluded to before, James was martyred for his faith in Christ in the AD 60s during a lapse in the civil government. Now, think about that. Most of us have brothers. What would it take to convince you that your brother is the Lord so that you would be willing to die for this belief? Can there be any doubt that the reason for this remarkable transformation in James is because, in Paul's words, then he appeared to James. Even Gerd Ludemann, who is the leading German New Testament critic of the resurrection today, himself admits, and I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain," and those are his words, not mine, "as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ."